Hello, my name is Howard Thomas. I'm the Dean of the Fellows College of the British Academy of Management, and it's my pleasure to introduce this afternoon's session, which is an extension of a real interest the Fellows have in the subject of race, gender equity, and those kinds of issues. This follows on from a session we undertook last year at the Academy conference. That session was called Taking Race Seriously. This is more broadly holding up a mirror to race and gender equity in business schools. So without more ado, I welcome you and pass you on to the chair for this afternoon's session, the Deputy Dean-elect of the Fellows of the Academy of the British Academy of Management, Fiona Wilson from Glasgow University. Fiona, it's over to you.
Thank you, Howard. Welcome everybody to this fellow session today. I'm very glad you've been able to join us. We've got a stellar lineup of speakers today, and I'm very, very pleased to introduce them. First of all, we have Martina Sliwa, who's at Essex Business School, and she's been Vice Chair of Equality, Diversion and Inclusivity at the British Academy of Management, and she's been researching the practices and challenges and failures of equality, diversity and inclusion in UK business and management schools. We have Professor Nellarine Cornelius, who's Professor of Organisation Studies at Queen Mary University of London, and she is Associate Dean for People, Culture and Inclusion. And we have Professor Emmanuel Ogbonna, who is Professor of Management and Organisation at Cardiff University. One of his many research interests is ethnic minorities, and he has recently reported on the impact of COVID-19 on Black, Asian and minority ethnic people in Wales. Professor Zoe Radner is from the University of Law, where she's Deputy Vice-Chancellor, and previously she was Vice Principal for Strategy and Planning in Equality, Diversity and Inclusion at City University in London. So as you can see, we have an absolutely fabulous lineup of speakers today, and I really hope you're going to enjoy this session. You should find that there's a Q&A button on the right-hand side of your screen, and so you will be able to ask questions. And there is time at the end at about 3 minutes past 3 when you'll be able to have your questions shared, and the panelists will try and answer some of your queries. So if we could get started, if Martina's here, that would be good. If she isn't, Nellarine very kindly has offered to start. I'm assuming Martina isn't here, and so Nellarine's going to talk about what has changed in tackling race inequality in higher education, and is also going to touch on the subject of intersectionality.
Thank you very much, Fiona. Hopefully everybody can hear me loud and clear. Most of the work that I've been doing recently for British Academy of Management, the Chartered Management Institute, and the business in the community has focused on race. And at Queen Mary, as has been mentioned by Fiona, I am the People, Culture and Inclusion lead in the School of Business and Management. But I also sit on the university's EDI steering group. So I'm going to be moving between these two perspectives, and I'm going to be focusing on accountability and governance. Now, very recently, we've had quite a major shift at Queen Mary. There's been an appointment of a vice principal for People and Cultural Inclusion. So they sit in the Vice Principal's office for part of the University of London. So that's equivalent to a Pro-Vice Chancellor. And there were some things that struck me as the EDI strategy and policy was unrolling across the college and also obviously within the school, and builds on work that has been done for some years within the school. There is clearly a hierarchy of engagement with race in particular in most UK universities. And I would say broadly, the hierarchy is students, then academic staff, and then professional services staff. Now, I guess the focus on students is because of the HESA return requirements, particularly for undergraduate and postgraduate taught programs. There's much less focus on PGR students, doctoral students in that perspective. So that is an important, I would suggest, work in progress that needs to be engaged with right across business schools. Then there's academic staff, and I would suggest that the real focus has been on gender, largely because of Athena Swan. That's been well established. And even though there's an increasing requirement to look at gender at the intersection with other protected categories, and particularly race, which also falls under the Equalities Act, the real progression and progress, I would suggest, although there's more progress that's needed, has been on gender in universities and business schools, and race is some way behind. Professional services staff and adjunct staff in business schools, we have least progress, indeed least information for them. And that's important, because my hunch is that internal accountability and external evaluation is important for EDI priorities, and in particular race. Now, let's just go back very briefly to Athena Swan. Now, we know that there are revisions that have been made this year. The approach is more holistic, and there's more of a change management orientation. So the things that are familiar are collect and analyze data, review your policies, create an action plan. So the evidence base was important, and it remains important. But there's more emphasis on culture, implement and evidencing the success of the action plan. So it's not just about intentions, but the accountability is in terms of the sustainability of what you've decided to do. Now, a few years ago, along with colleagues at BAM, including Emmanuel and others, and with a advisory group, which was an industrial advisory group, I undertook a project, which is a BAM CMI project, race in the management pipeline for FTSE 100 companies. Now, I draw upon that really for just one element, which is relevant to the talk today, which is the public face of the FTSE 100. So what we did was looked at websites, looked at their HRM documents, their EDI policy documents, the roles that were in place to address EDI, particularly race, the evidence base they were drawing on, and the change management approach that they were taking. Now, what we found when we looked at these 100 companies was there were about 15 that were leading. They had extensive evidence of good policy and practice. There were about 35 that were progressing, and there was some modest evidence of good policy and practice, and 50 that we would say was starting, and actually a number of them had nothing in particular. So there was limited or no evidence of policy or practice development. But let's go back to British universities. So let's turn our attention to the Race at Work Charter. Now, the Race at Work Charter is the kite mark for race equality action, the main kite mark in the UK. Now, they started off by encouraging organizations to appoint an executive sponsor. So this is a C-suite sponsor, could be the chief executive or somebody in the chief executive's team, and to capture ethnicity data and publicize progress. Now, they've added to that to commit at board level to zero tolerance of harassment and bullying, because the former Race at Work survey, actually conducted by Business in the Community, who was responsible for the kite mark, found that there was very high levels of bullying and harassment in relation to race. So that suggests that the leadership, and in particular HR department, need to be upskilled in this area. And we need to also make clear, they also wanted signatories to make clear that supporting equality in the workplace is the responsibility of all leaders and management. So it's a kind of not something that just is an aspiration, but embedded in the management and leadership structures, that there's a need to take action to support ethnic minority career progression, something that we've taken pretty seriously at Queen Mary, and I know other institutions have as well. However, the downside is that there are only, for the 2021 list of Race at Work signatories, out of the 140 universities, there are only 10 that are signed up. That's pretty shameful in my view. So my final comments are these. Many universities would assert that they're recruiting large numbers of ethnic minority students, often from socioeconomically challenged backgrounds in the UK, which they are. But how many are proactively taking the right kind of action to ensure progression, good progression, attainment standards, and good job destinations on graduation? There is training, and a lot of it is online and quite extensive, around EDA unconscious bias training, but these are only first steps. There's a need, however, the data would suggest, and the policy development for the accreditation bodies would suggest, is to have really good, clear governance and accountability structures, and an evidence base is key to the development of race equality policy and strategy. External accountability, I would suggest, is absolutely vital. So the progress that's been made around gender diversity has been facilitated in part by Athena Swan, but also gender pay gap reporting. And we know that some universities have also engaged in ethnicity pay gap reporting, but that absolutely has to be done if we want to make progress. I think that external accountability around race is critical for success. And in order that internal accountability and governance structures are set up in the right way. I think coming down the track, more external accreditation bodies will be seeking it. And we know that the UN Declaration on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination is going to be part of that momentum. And then finally, I would suggest that there's a need to engage in but understand that corporate identity management online needs to reflect the lived reality of race in universities for staff and students. It's not just a PR exercise. Okay, Fiona, that's it from me.
That's brilliant. Thank you so much, Nelorine. You made some very, very big and very, very important points. So thank you very much for that. Very much appreciated. So welcome, Martina. Would you mind kicking off now?
I'm very happy to kick off now, and apologies for being a little late. Where our previous session, which I was running, just ran just 1 minute over time, and then it turned out that my Zoom system collapsed, and things take time, always a few minutes to get back on track. But I'm back on track, and I think I've heard most of your intervention, Nelorine. That's been fascinating. I've had the pleasure of being able to talk to you about the work that we have been doing at BAM over the past year in the area of equality, diversity, and inclusivity. My name is Martina Śliwa, and I'm the Vice Chair of BAM for EDI. And there are a number of initiatives that we have been leading on and trying to implement in order to be able to embed the values of equality, diversity, and inclusivity, as well as respect in everything we do. This is the ambition that we have at BAM. And for those of you who haven't previously heard about those things, the overall idea is to be able to really look at all our internal processes at BAM and to make sure that the way we organize things, the way we go around about our own governance structures, everything we do is infused by those EDI values, which are core to what we do at BAM. They are our strategic values. They are core to what we want to do as an association. But at the same time, we have an ambition to be able to really have a leading role in helping business schools in the UK and beyond, as well as perhaps the broader university sector in that endeavor of embedding EDI, our values in what they do. I've got a few examples, and I know we have very little time, so I'll just mention those. And if anybody is interested in finding out more about it, I'd be very happy to either take questions or just speak in a different forum about these things. But we have been active in this field, in this area for the past year. For example, we have now a statement of EDI values for BAM. We have on our website examples of the kind of activities that we undertake. And amongst those, the most important one has been the strategic research project that BAM has commissioned, and I have been the principal investigator on the project. And the project is entitled Equality, Diversity, Inclusion and Respect in UK Business and Management Schools. And I thought it would be really important to say a few things about the project and the findings from it. And I think it really complements well what other members of the panel are talking about. And to say that there are certain problems which have been kind of diagnosed through the findings from that project. Now, the project has involved has consisted of two parts, one of which has been quantitative research, a quantitative analysis of statistical data, staff record data in relation to staff from UK Schools of Business and Management, purchased from Hisan for the year 2018-2019. And on the other hand, we have also conducted an in-depth qualitative study with a range of participants who occupy on one hand, they are diverse in terms of gender, ethnicity, nationality. On the other hand, occupy leadership positions within UK Schools of Business and Management. And we have first conducted the statistical analysis to get an idea of what the key issues seem to be coming to us from the big picture. And then we also conducted in parallel that qualitative study to get an in-depth understanding of the issues. So to give you some highlights from the key findings from Hisan data analysis. So first of all, our analysis has found that there is a 6% gender imbalance in business and management schools in favor of men. And this is double that in the whole UK HEI labor market. So there is nowhere really within the entire market there isn't a parity in terms of gender, but within the business schools it's 6% gender imbalance, and that's in terms of employment numbers. Now, interestingly, though there is a relative parity at the lower level of career progression, and we are talking about academics, I should have mentioned it. We looked at the staff record data with reference to academic staff. Even though there is a gender parity at the levels at the entry level of lecturer, this gender parity disappears with career progression. And as we go up the ladder, on average across all UK business schools, only 26% of all professors are women. And interestingly, that picture varies when we look at the type of university. So, for example, in a post-92 university, women are 34% of all professors are women, whereas in Russell Group universities, this percentage is much lower. So on the one hand, there is the inequality imbalance in terms of gender within senior academic positions altogether across business schools, but also depending on which type of institution the business school is part of. That was we thought a very interesting finding. At the same time, we looked at ethnicity-related data, looking at the kind of data that are collected by Hisan. They all staff are asked to self-identify as one of several ethnic groups. And what we found is that 28% of business and management school academics identify as an ethnic minority, and within that, 5% are Black, 17% identify as Asian, 2% as mixed, and 3% as being from an other ethnic group. So in terms of non-white staff or staff from ethnic minorities, it's just over 1/4. Apologies. However, again, as with gender, ethnic diversity in business schools amongst academics significantly decreases with academic professors. So only 2% of professors in business and management schools identify as Black, 2% as mixed, and 16% as Asian. So we get that big picture of what these imbalances look like, what these inequalities look like in terms of numbers at different levels of of career progression. And now when we look at the intersection of gender and ethnicity, we see how actually this picture, that situation becomes even more exacerbated in terms of acting really to the disadvantage of people who share both characteristics. So they are both a woman and a member of an ethnic minority. So amongst so there is that gender employment gap whereby only 32% of those staff, for example, who identified as Black are women, right? And amongst those, very, very few are professors. Now, that's the big picture of our quantitative analysis. On top of it, we then conducted qualitative analysis as well, which was based on data captured through longitudinal diaries, audio diaries, and interviewing. And what we have found, again, is that there is a combination of institutionalized social structures, such as promotion processes, mentoring programs in institutions, as well as informal social norms, which, such as networking or sponsoring, which work to the disadvantage of members of minority groups. So to give you some examples of what we found is that, for example, those participants who were identifying as white men often described having been invited to take on senior roles, to being tapped on the shoulder to go for something, to take on a role, whereas women participants and participants from ethnic minorities would talk to us about going always through the formal routes and not necessarily having been approached, having been informally asked to do something. On the other hand, what we found is that certain jobs, certain roles in business was associated with men, such as research leadership, research management, were seen as more valuable. And those jobs which were associated with women, such as teaching leadership, teaching management, they were seen as less valuable in business schools. On the other hand, networking activities were seen to more often take place in men-friendly environments. Obviously, the research was conducted actually during the pandemic, but participants often reflected on their professional trajectory. So they talked about events such as going to pubs, staying up in a bar late at a conference, and taking part in networking in those kinds of environments. Now, what we have found as well is that institutionalized programs which are aimed at promoting greater equality and inclusivity, such as Athena Swan accreditation, they didn't seem to clearly bring about sustained practical change and make impact on people's progression or career enhancements. On the contrary, what really matters to people's experience and career progression was what was happening to them on a daily basis. And we have we speak in our report and in our findings about a cumulative privilege and cumulative disadvantage, which then has an effect on both how an individual progresses in their career, but also how that person feels about the job, how they feel about an institution and their own place within it. And very interestingly, we even had participants commenting on how they feel that the same institution is very different to them as a workplace as the same institution for a different colleagues. And those lines of differences were going along the lines of gender and ethnicity. I'll stop here because I guess my time is coming to an end, but just I hope this gives a good representation of the findings from our study. Thank you.
That was excellent. Thank you very much, Martina. That was a very good and very quick summary of your findings, and I hope people will follow up with questions. So thank you very much for that. Emmanuel's next.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Fiona. I want to start by drawing your attention to a recent report by the Equalities and Human Rights Commission, which found the type of things that Nelarin and Martina have been talking about. It found widespread racial harassment in UK universities. But more importantly, I want to draw your attention to comments that were made by Professor David Richardson, who is the Vice Chancellor of East Anglia, who is also the university's UK lead on race. And I quote from him, "It is my firm belief that UK universities perpetuate institutional racism. This is uncomfortable to acknowledge, but all university leaders should do so as a first step towards meaningful change." It isn't just institutional racism. You can add to that institutional sexism, disabilism, and in fact, all the protected characteristics are implicated in this. The question, though, is, are universities and especially business schools taking the lead to generate this substantial cultural change that is required to be able to address institutional imbalances? It's got to be substantive to be able to do that, because if you are saying, this is a leader of a university that is representing universities and is saying that universities are institutionally racist, not many universities have done anything about this. Not many universities have even acknowledged it. Not many business school heads have acknowledged it, but at least we are talking about it today, and we are trying to do something about it to encourage others. Business schools should be leading in this area. This is the area that we teach. This is the area that we study. We teach social responsibility, we teach organizational change, we teach leadership, we teach ethics, and so on and so forth. So we should be leading. And if we are not leading, other people would come in and lead. I worry that if business schools don't lead in this area, then businesses would come in and lead. We are already seeing examples of that. A number of businesses are responding and building allies. You have, going from the United States to this country, United States, what happened with the change of name of Washington Redskins? Organizations said never, and institutions that backed them said you must change your name, and they changed the racist iconography that was Washington Redskins. We know that in the UK, companies like Legal and General are coming forward and saying to organizations, we will use our power to vote out any chairperson in a FTSE 100 organization that does not have at least one member of ethnic minority communities in their board of directors. I hope by the end of this year, it will be interesting to see how that works. We also know that governments are taking more active steps in this area. Certainly in Wales, where I am working with the Welsh government on creating a new race equality action plan, we are looking to develop a series of mechanisms through which organizations will be controlled in a sense, or at least encouraged. The idea is to find ways of closing that implementation gap. Others have spoken about accreditation bodies who are already looking to strengthen what they do. We know that Athena Swan is strengthening, and others will follow suit. So if business schools are not in that mix, then other people would come in and lead this area. And it would be quite sad if we allowed other people to come in and lead this area. And of course, students are becoming more active. Social media, the power of social media would help them to force us to do the things that we should be doing. They are, after all, business students, and they will, soon enough, they will realize their power and their influence. I think they already know it. It's a matter of time before they will do it in relation to EDI. So we need to be doing something about this. What should we be leading on as business schools? I think the first thing we should be doing is to acknowledging the existence of institutionalized, whether it's racism or sexism, to acknowledge the nature of the problem, because it's only by acknowledging the nature of the problem that we can begin to do something to fix it, to engage in the type of culture change that is required to be able to fix this major problem. It isn't going to be a quick fix, but business schools are full of people who are experts in these areas. It is, again, after all, what we teach. We have change specialists, leadership specialists, organizational culture specialists. For crying out loud, we do consulting for organizations. And I think it would be fraudulent on our part if we go out and consult for organizations to manage change, and we can't even lead our own change processes, or indeed lead on change in this type of significant area. And the second thing I think is probably the more important thing that businesses or business schools should do is to lead on closing the implementation gap. I think Nelarin pointed out the difficulty in this area, how institutions are failing to develop the appropriate set of governance structures that would enable them to close the perennial implementation gap in EDI initiatives. And we know already that there is legislation that would help us to do this. The 2010 Equalities Act provides all sorts of instruments that any institution, any organization that want to work in this area can use. We know that we have the public sector equality duties, which says that business schools and the like must not only eliminate discrimination, but should actively promote equality. We are not promoting equality actively. We know this evidence from the RC report and Advanced HE and UCU, that over 50% of university BME staff described incidents of being ignored or excluded, which they linked to their race. That is significant. So if you look at your department, 1 in 2 people would have been ignored because of their race. Over 25% of people describe name calling, insults, and jokes, and 20% of BME students experience physical attacks. And that's quite significant, really, when you think about it. And the same goes with gender, the same goes with disability, not providing appropriate places of work. And what should we do in that regard? We should focus on using the instruments the law already provides. Equality impact assessment is underutilized in business schools and in universities. We should really be doing diversity audits of our existing policies and our new initiatives to see how they may impact on other people. And I think I am struggling coming up with the end. So I'm going to end it here by saying that we are talking more about EDI. We're talking more so than ever before. But all this positive talk would lead to nothing unless we aim to close that gap between the positive statements we make and the concrete actions we take. And I think business schools should be at the forefront of leading on eliminating the historical injustices in this area. Thank you.
Thank you, Emmanuel. That was excellent. That was such a good set of points you had there. So thank you very much for your contribution. Next, we have Zoe talking about the action in practice and driving race equity at an institutional level.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed, Fiona, and thank you very much for all those speakers. It's quite amazing, and that call to action that Emmanuel made at the end there is so important, having listened to the 1 o'clock news today, when you think about the situation we're in and about some of the possible dare I say, backward steps that's happening globally in countries, including the US, in terms of women's rights. So the call for action for business schools and universities, I think, needs to continue and needs to be loud and needs to be clear on a global basis. And it's up to us as academics and universities and business schools to do that. As Fiona said, I'm Zoe Radnor. I am Deputy Vice Chancellor at the University of Law, but previously I was Pro Vice Chancellor equivalent of EDI at City University of London. And I want to talk a little bit about some of the action that we took. And why that's so relevant in terms of the panel today is because I was the lead for race equality at City, where approximately 55% of our students were of colour and around 70% of those were from the undergraduate. So 70% of undergraduate, 55% in total. But only 17% of our academics were of colour and only 26% of the staff overall were of colour. So we were not representing the student population at City. But more importantly, some of you will be aware that when Black Lives Matters hit, that actually we changed the name of our business school. So there we were with a world-renowned business school in the FTE rankings, known by many of you as Cass Business School, and now is known as Bain's Business School. And that action that was taken to remove the name was really important, because the work we had to do was more than just a name, which was being said in all of the material that was being developed. And there was then a deep dive survey that was carried out within the business school, and some quite shocking results, of some of which Emmanuel has alluded to, that were happening within our business school. So the work that had to be done was not just in the business school, but across the whole institution. And that was really key. And we were in a spotlight position where we had to take action, that we could no longer accept some of those issues that were being left at home and not being brought into that place of work, which needed to be addressed because it was making an impact on people's working lives. And one of the first things that happened was what was known as the Bain Affinity group. Many of you have those in your institutions, renamed themselves as the Network for Racial Justice. And I set up an ongoing dialogue with a network of racial justice and placed all of the executive members, every single one of us, about 11/12 of us, into subgroups with members of the NRJ to make sure that we looked at an action plan to take action across the institution. And that was alongside applying for the Race Equality Charter, which at the time I left was planned to be applied for in February 2022. So what are the areas we did? What did we do? What action did we take? Well, there are a number of things. First of all, we sought to change the language. We also took action. We created safe spaces for active listening and learning, and we ensured accountability. So just to unpack those briefly, in terms of seeking to create language, we tried to reframe the way we talked about EDI. We tried to encourage colleagues to use alternative, sensitive language. And we also tried to create spaces where we could challenge and push back sensitively, but assertively, if certain terminology and ideas were mentioned. So we know that, and now it's often labeled as microaggressions or micro comments. But what we tried to do was create spaces where it was acceptable to be challenging some of those languages in order to uplift voices, particularly voices of women of colour across the institution. That was really important. And that was constant, but subtle, but important. The next area was around taking action and targeted action and all sorts of things. We set up a club called Diversify Your Mind, which still takes place, which is monthly. It was online, it was informal, it was reading books, it was watching films, it was looking at podcasts. There's a series that's on BBC, Small Acts. So it was about watching those and talking about them, watching some politically based films, but also reading books such as Why Am I No Longer Talking to White People About Race, and discussing that within those groups on a monthly basis. And all sorts of people came to those, and it was fantastic. It was also about training in terms of inclusive mentoring and also allyship development as well, which was really key. The notion of allyship and working in communities to support some of the work around tackling anti-racism. We also set up what we called a reciprocal mentoring scheme. This is not a reverse mentoring scheme. It was quite deliberately called reciprocal mentoring. And it was a senior member of exec who was talking about leadership, and a member of staff of colour, that basically they came together as mentor and mentees, and they learned from each other in terms of those journeys. There's been 3 sets of 12 of those, and they have been taken up exceptionally well. We're also doing a mentoring scheme with a nearby institution, that was London Met, and doing some work across institutions as well, which was really, really important. We opened up PhD studentships, particularly for the business school, for Black students, Black British students, because we saw there was a gap in terms of our PhD studentships. As well as other universities, of course, there's the awarding gap, curriculum review, but we've also taken positive action, picking up Emmanuel's point, that all key decision-making bodies at the university should have at least 2 members of colour on those committees. That was really, really important. As I left, That was around 50% of all decision-making bodies had that, and I really hope that that has continued, as well as the report and supports tool for both students and staff. So there are all many different actions that were taking place all across the institution. But we wanted to also create safe spaces for active listening and learning. And that's about having forums, equality, diversity and inclusion forums. Some were on race, some were on gender, disability, but also about intersectionality. That was really important as well to talk about that. It was keeping up those regular strategic conversations between the Network for Racial Justice and the executive team, and also about upskilling through the mentoring and education programs for all of the senior leaders in the institution. And also, very importantly, a strong link with the Students' Union. And that was really key in this whole agenda about working very, very closely with the Students' Union. We held a town hall event where people shared some of their lived experiences, both staff and students. And some of those stories that were shared were really quite shocking and upsetting to many individuals. So what we wanted to do was to ensure commitment and also to ensure accountability. And that's what, going right back to the start of my talk, those regular meetings between the executive board and the Network for Racial Justice to see where we were on the action plan, to build that action plan up to the Race Equality Charter action plan and be part of the Race Equality Charter self-assessment team. So all of those things were interlinked. The actions for the institution were therefore linked into the Race Equality Charter plan. So the REC became just an outcome of the work that was being done. It wasn't a driver for that work. But also it was about ensuring that the voices of staff and students was constant about the lived experience. The mantra was so people could bring their whole selves to work and study. And we wanted to create a safe space by which that could happen. But most importantly, one thing that we felt was important to do was to be able to have all these conversations through changing the language, through taking action, through creating safe spaces and allowing accountability by reaching a point where people were comfortable with being uncomfortable, that they were comfortable with having uncomfortable conversations. And we need to recognize that it's an emotional journey for many individuals, and we have to work together to make sure we create that really inclusive environment for all. Thank you very much.
That was great. Thank you very much, Zoe. I really appreciate that input too, that this idea of being able to state exactly what you did and how you did it, I think must be very useful to the audience today. So thank you. We can move now into the question and answer part of the session today. And we've got lots of questions in on the chat. And the first question is, what single thing do the panel think we could most usefully do as individuals to improve equity in our professional community? Maybe, Emmanuel, would you maybe like to kick off, seeing if you have an answer to that question?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. And I would say that the most important thing that individuals can do is to equip themselves with what it is to be, whether it is anti-racist or indeed racist or sexist or whatever protected characteristic one is looking at. I say that because in the area, the space that I work, which is racism, I find that a lot of people don't understand what it is to be racist, because a lot of people believe that if they are non-racist, then that is sufficient and that they can do no harm, which is why we speak a lot about unconscious bias, when in fact we should be speaking about racism. So people need to be able to educate themselves on what it is to, say, be racist or be sexist, because once they understand that, then their behaviors can change, and they can also help to educate other people.
Thank you. Would any other members of the panel like to just have a very quick answer to that question?
I would just fundamentally agree with them. It's education and educating yourself. I think is really, really critical. And that's a really important part of it, is the journey that I've gone through. That's the one thing that was said to me constantly. It's not up to us to teach you, it's up for you to learn yourself in terms of the agenda, and particularly when it comes to race, and that to me is really, really important. So I would just support what Emmanuel said in terms of that.
Yes, thank you. Any others? Yeah, Martina.
Yes, thank you, Fiona. I'd like to add, and I agree obviously with both Emmanuel and Zoe, but what I'd like to add to it is as well, because the question is asked in a sense that what could most usefully, what could we all as individuals, but as individuals we occupy different positions, and I think quite often members of the dominant group, such as the ethnic majority and the gender, those who are privileged in terms of gender, so tend to think, I think we often think that a way to redress imbalances is by supporting the ones who are disadvantaged. How do we support you? And I think one thing that could be very usefully done is to say, well, if we are prepared for someone else to have a bigger piece of that cake, bigger slice, then we need to be prepared to have a smaller slice ourselves. And that kind of preparedness, that we're not only learning, educating ourselves, but also that perhaps we sometimes need to give up on some of our advantages and privileges, is not just about the focus of the ones who are disadvantaged, but also soul searching and saying, oh, perhaps I've had enough already, and now somebody else could have their turn, and that's how I would support them.
Thank you. Yes. I'm going to move on now to a second question, which is what, with the pressures, how do we ensure that D&I, that diversity and inclusion is everyone's responsibility, and that schools are not seen as jumping on the bandwagon post BLM movement with regards to their race equality and diversity and inclusion strategy? So how do we make sure it's everybody's problem? Melanie, would you like to speak?
Yes, I would. And it links to another comment that was made about EDI leads within business schools, who often see them, are expected to be lone battlers. And actually, I would say is yet a bit more corporate reputation management. We have an EDI lead, so we're doing EDI, which is clearly a silly statement. So my view is this. It's really very important to recognize that this is an institutional challenge. I mean, this is the point that Emmanuel was making. And I remain concerned that there is a danger in compartmentalizing EDI action. There's a kind of path that goes from the EDI lead to the EDI manager to the EDI corporate lead. And that's not the way it is. The other thing that I would say is important for really effective change is not to assume that the EDI lead is anything but a specialist. The real EDI work has to be done by the leadership team within business schools and within institutions. But the other area which is important, and I say this in my capacity as vice principal for the Chartered Institute of Personal Development, is that career paths and HR's understanding of EDI in relation to career paths has to be seriously upskilled. What many people won't realize is until recently, when I insisted there was a change, there was no core module on EDI for professional HR managers who were taking the CIPD qualifications, which is kind of shocking. Hasn't been the case for 15 years. So universities, if they want to take things seriously, of course, they have to look at their governance structures. They need to look at their C-suite. They need to have effective EDI leads, not just somebody who's enthusiastic, but people who understand data management, change management, HR, etc. Because there's too much of that. Enthusiasts who really have very little practicality in terms of the skill sets that are needed for this. But we really need to focus on, I think, areas where we can move relatively quickly in terms of building the evidence base about who is what, where, doing what, and how we can move in terms of advancing people's career progression. Not just that they move, but the pace at which they move also increases. But that has to be done in a kind of collaboration between the C-suite, senior leadership teams, deans of business schools, and actually HR. They all need to be joined up. Otherwise, things will just get stuck. I think if things could move there, that would be an incredibly strong signal for staff. And of course, around progression and attainment and jobs, there's another piece of work that needs to be done to make sure that people understand the disadvantages that are accumulated for people of color and women in business schools in particular.
Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you. These are all such good points. Another question is, do you see age discrimination as another area, or is this, according to the evidence, less of an issue relative to other kinds of discrimination? Would anybody like to comment on that? Nelorine?
Sorry, I'm sorry, I don't want to hog it, so I'll say it very quickly. I think that we understand age discrimination best at the intersection with race and gender, particularly gender. So there are things that are assumed to be more difficult as people become older. And actually, I speak as a psychologist, there's very little evidence that that is the case. This really sits in a relatively archaic, given the Equalities Act, a relatively archaic view of who should be where at what point in the career structures of universities. And we have to abandon that. We have the Equalities Act of 2010, and I'm afraid universities are so focused on pensions and retirement, they kind of sweep that to one side. So I think we need to get back to looking at, in particular, race at the intersection. And we need to remember that there is no retirement age anymore, not officially in terms of the law. So universities may have one for actuarial purposes and pension purposes, but legally there isn't one. And we need to keep that in mind, bear that in mind.
Yeah, that's very good. Thank you. Madeline Barrows is asking, what single thing do the panel think we could most usefully do as individuals to improve equity in the professional community? Anybody like to come up with an answer to that one?
I think it's a similar response to what we gave about, you know, it's the same whether you're an academic or a professional service, it's the same sort of response. But I wouldn't mind, I think Emmanuel might have had a point as well. I'm going back to the point about how do we create sustainability in this agenda, which links into a question I think Katie Mason's asked me about, do I think the work that I set up, the answer is, I had the same question in my mind, Katie, to be honest, when I was preparing for this talk yesterday and over the weekend, was I wondered, is the work continuing? I think I'd like to say I really hope so. And one of the things I've tried to do to ensure that that be the case is brought in an assistant pro vice chancellor for EDI, race equality, just before I left. And I know she's doing brilliant work, Jessica Jones-Nielsen. And I also know that some of the other work that's being done is being continued. But that leadership piece that Nerine outlined is so critical. It really, really is. And I made a point that I made sure as the executive lead that there wouldn't be literally from the last 12, 18 months all the way through COVID and every other time that I would mention and I would talk about EDI in some form at every single executive meeting. I was the devil on their shoulder. That could be why I'm not going to say another word on that. But the point is the fact that that you need somebody there that is more than just an enthusiast, that is actually willing to be a disruptor, that to talk about and a lot about, because then what happens is you allow the point that I made in my talk around that spaces and those voices, you give legitimacy to those voices around the institution, which therefore means that there's nowhere for people to hide around these agendas. So what you have to do is give that safe space, give that the legitimacy, and that has to come from the leadership. So I do hope some of that work that I've done is continuing and has to keep continuing. And I'm starting the journey to some degree, although we're very lucky to have an executive member, Pratchett Johnson, ex-University of Manchester, now University of Law, who's taken up the agenda at University of Law. But we need it be multiple voices in multiple places and give people that space to say what they need to say. I think is important. I know Manuel wanted to come back on that. Probably.
I think that's really useful, and also to add to what Nelarin said, we have to be sure that we are avoiding the problems we had in the past with diversity managers. I think Nelarin will remember being external to one of my doctoral students who studied diversity managers in the NHS and the difficulties they had being recognized. If EDI is important to an organization, then they have to make sure that they give it a seat on the main board, so that it is part of the decision making and not something that is tagged on at the end. And the other thing we must do as business schools, as organizations, if we value this thing, then we should make it part of our key performance indicator. And I'm working with the Welsh government on this. And one of the things I discussed with the permanent secretary of the Welsh government was, if this is that important, then it should be part of your KPI. And she said, yes, it is that important. And she actually went to change her KPIs to include leading an anti-racist government in Wales, or an anti-racist civil service in Wales as part of her KPIs. So if she fails, then her salaries, her career prospects would have failed in that direction as well, which means she's going to do everything she can to make it succeed. And I think we should get all the business school deans to do the same.
Yes, Nelarin.
Just a very quick follow-up to Emmanuel and Zoe's points. I think it's very important that if we really want good accounting and governance structures, then there needs to be a clear reporting structure. So setting a KPI is important, but very often people flounder in terms of how they report how they've managed that KPI. So I think the development of very clear reporting accounts and reporting structures matters. So one of the things that we've done at Queen Mary is every department, every school, every institute has to produce a strategic plan around EDI, which is evidence-based and for which they have set targets for race and gender on an annual basis. I think that's critical.
Yeah, thank you. Another very good point. Maybe got time just to squeeze one last question in. There's a question for Zoe. Do you think the work that you did has led to permanent changes in practice for the better?
As I sort of really picked up on that in my previous answer, as I said, I'd really like to hope so. I really like to hope so. But thank you very much for that. And I think Neralin's final points there around reporting, I think, is a really positive way, an important way in terms of making action happen in terms of this work. So I think that, thank you.
Yeah, I agree. And I know I'm chairing, I'm not supposed to have points of view, but I'm wondering if the accreditation bodies, if they had these KPIs, then universities might focus more on these issues if they were being judged by the accreditation bodies on inclusion, diversity and equality. So then maybe that's a way to go in the future. But we're running very quickly out of time. So thank you very much. I feel very privileged today to have had such an incredibly strong set of panelists. I'm so very glad to be able to hear your thoughts today, to hear about your knowledge, your expertise. It was just brilliant. Really, really enjoyed it. And I hope everybody else did. So thank you very much for your contributions, and to the audience for their excellent set of questions. It was just a very interesting and informative session we had today, and it'd be great if we could go forward from here with equality, diversity and inclusion more firmly lodged in our minds in order that we improve on these things in the future. So thank you very much today for your participation.
Thank you.
You.
Thank you, Fiona.
Thank you.